So we're out here working on the SeaQuestor Flyer today on the linkage for connecting our two rear thrusters so that we can steer the SeaQuestor Flyer. We're using a Lenco linear actuator, which is normally used for plane controls on the back of a boat. We ultimately will be oil compensating this as well as our thrusters through this part here. I'll talk about that in a second. But we created linkage. We've machined UHMW as our sleeves to go through the steel plate. That way there's no metal-to-metal contact. Everything's connected with the UHMW. So let's take a look, because this thing will rotate 45 degrees in less than 4 seconds. So let's take a look. So ultimately, we'll put some stops on this so that from the pilot's position, we know exactly when the thrusters hit 45. The linear actuator actually will stop pulling once it gets to that point anyway, so it's kind of built into the system. But we do want to put an indicator on here so that we can see what direction the actual thrusters are pointing in case we're not sure where the joystick is when we're actually operating. So that's that. So in addition to that, you might notice these black risers coming out of the aluminum tubes that go down into our thruster. These actually are UHMW high molecular weight plastic that we had machined out, and there's a series of 3 ports that we have built into it. This is where we will do our oil compensation as well as temperature sensors and a few other little things we're putting in here, so we can actually do that without actually having to tap our thrusters and get near the magnetics and so forth. We're doing the same thing with our linear actuator. So they'll all be tied to the same type of system as a bladder control, oil compensated, so that there's no bubbles of air inside this thing. We'll probably pull a vacuum on these thrusters before we finish filling them. But ultimately, these ports up here at the very highest point is where the air can actually escape to as we're filling it and so forth. So that's it. In the background, you'll see we've got 3 of our high pressure air tanks. They're actually set up with our valve system that goes inside the main pressure hull. The interesting thing about them is this. You got to find parts that work when you're building something one-off, right? So this is a normal tank boot that goes on top of a 80 cubic or an 8-inch steel tank. Turns out it's about a 1/4 inch bigger than what goes on the aluminum 80s. So by just grinding off this outer lip on those tanks, I'm able to slide them into this boot. So I actually have complete, I guess it's like a hard plastic material, as a guide sitting in top of the steel frame here, and then also down below where the tanks are actually sitting. They're actually sitting inside a shell like this. So they're actually supported and surrounded by this material, both top and bottom, so we don't have any movement of banging around and so forth. And then they'll have a climbing system on top here when we get the final exo shell on it. So anyway, that's the SeaQuestor Flyer for today. Kind of cool to see the thrusters actually working, and took a little bit of work to get the linkage to set up right so it didn't conflict with itself, but it actually works pretty darn good, and I'm surprised how fast it is. So it'll be real interesting to see how it is in the water once we get it going. So anyway, there we go. Thanks for stopping by.